the Count of Saint Germain. Just who exactly was this person that has been referenced throughout history, and why are there sightings of him by so many people at so many different times, when we know that the average lifespan for a person back in old Europe was probably something like 40 or 50 years old, maybe 60 if you were lucky. However, this man was seen at countless events during countless times, and nobody has any explanation for why that is. Legend has it that the Count of Saint Germain had knowledge on just about everything, and not just a little bit of knowledge here and there. He could carry on an extensive conversation about subjects as if he was an expert in that field. And many people claim that this guy found the secret to immortality. And in fact, he's better known as the immortal, but there are also rumors of him being some kind of a time traveler. And maybe he wasn't so much an immortal, but he was able to skip timelines. And there are even some bizarre stories about him being placed in the 21st century. Legend has it that the Count of Saint Germain walked during the time of Christ, and he seems to show up at various points in the history of Europe. Some people call him an alchemist and said he had supernatural powers, but nobody really knows the mysterious origin of the Count of Saint Germain. And the crazy part about him, no matter when anybody saw him or anybody met him, no matter what time period this was, he always seemed to be anywhere from 35 to 45 years old. No younger, no older. So according to legend, the Count of Saint Germain was a mysterious European adventurer, alchemist, and philosopher who rose to prominence in the mid-18th century high society. He remained an enigmatic figure ever since he was spotted. His real origins and name are unknown, and he was known for his scientific expertise in all areas. He had remarkable musical talent. He was a linguist of some kind. He was said to have been able to have spoken many languages, and he had many, many skills. And he was also rumored to be some kind of an occultist who discovered the secret to immortality, including claims that he was some kind of a time traveler because he was spotted during so many time periods throughout history. And in fact, whether or not you consider him a time traveler or an immortal, there's actually other groups of people that, for their own reasons, think that he's some kind of a prophet, as he was able to predict the rise of the French and American revolutions. He was also able to predict the rise of a fascist government in Germany in the 1930s, and he also predicted the United States turning into a global superpower. The Count of Saint Germain had a notable relationship with Louis XV of France as a mysterious and influential figure at the French court. Louis XV entrusted him with important secret missions, including a diplomatic peace negotiation to end the 7 Years' War. As the story goes, in 1760, Louis XV sent the Count of Saint Germain on a secret mission to The Hague to explore whether England would accept a peace proposal that was favorable to France. Saint Germain carried letters from key French ministers and engaged with diplomats to try to end the war. However, the French foreign minister opposed Saint Germain's efforts and even sought his arrest for some reason. Now, despite this, Saint Germain managed to flee to England and continue on his diplomatic activities. He maintained favor with Louis XV and his powerful mistress, Madame Pompadour, who valued his intelligence and strange abilities. Louis XV was also said to have granted Saint Germain an apartment or a place there at the royal castle of Chambord, and the Count became an influential figure surrounded by notable individuals of that time. The Count of Saint Germain also appeared at the court of Catherine the Great of Russia, where he allegedly provided political counsel to aid in her rise to power. The Count of Saint Germain also had a notable association with her when it involved the ousting of Tsar Peter III, and it paved the way for Catherine to become the Empress in the year 1762. The involvement earned him a position of influence in the Russian court, where he became an esteemed visitor and advisor known for his expertise in alchemy, diplomacy, and various intellectual pursuits. According to legend, Saint Germain was invited by Catherine to her court in St. Petersburg after he impressed her during a visit to France. He helped secure power for her and later served as a diplomat and palace advisor during the Russian-Turkish War of 1768 to 1770, and for his service, he was given a high-ranking position in the Russian army using the alias General Weldon, though he eventually left Russia to continue his alchemy and esoteric work in Europe. Additionally, some mention his involvement with a mysterious artifact known as a Cage of Desire, which was linked to his travels to St. Petersburg and to the revolution that installed Catherine as an empress. His connections with influential figures in Russian society and his multifaceted talents made him a valued and enigmatic figure in Catherine's reign. The Count of Saint Germain had a mysterious and somewhat prophetic association with Marie Antoinette, and he is said to have warned her of impending disaster and danger facing the French monarchy before the French Revolution. According to the account, Saint Germain conveyed to Marie Antoinette and her close circle that a great social upheaval was imminent, with a prophecy about the downfall of the monarchy and the rise of revolutionary forces. He warned her of this political conspiracy that would result in the monarchy's destruction and predicted the tragic events that would unfold in the year 1793. Saint Germain reportedly had secret meetings with Marie Antoinette and her trusted advisors, providing insight and warning about the dangers of his so-called encyclopedia's party and the revolutionary elements undermining the monarchy. He urged caution and warned that failure to act would lead to a catastrophe in France. And despite these warnings, the Queen and her royal family were unable to avert the revolution. Some stories also suggest that Saint Germain appeared to Marie Antoinette in prison to warn her about the time and date of her own execution. The Count of Saint Germain had a notable but somewhat ambiguous association with the French Enlightenment writer Voltaire, who referred to Count of Saint Germain as the Wonder Man. Now, Voltaire mentioned Saint Germain in correspondence, describing him in somewhat skeptical terms with a hint of sarcasm. He referred to Saint Germain as the man who never dies, the man who knows everything, suggesting a reputation of seeming immortality and mysterious knowledge. This phrase, likely ironic, points to the enigmatic aura around Saint Germain rather than any kind of close relationship or partnership with him. Voltaire's reference indicates awareness of Saint Germain as a political and diplomatic figure involved in secret missions and intrigue across the European continent, though their direct interactions are never well documented. Casanova and the Count of Saint Germain had a well-documented acquaintance, notably described by Casanova himself in his memoirs. Casanova recounted a memorable dinner where he met the Count of Saint Germain, describing him as a fascinating conversationalist who talked throughout the entire meal, and Casanova himself listened pretty attentively, noting that Saint Germain was unmatched in conversation. Despite Saint Germain's extravagant claims, such as being more than 300 years old, knowing the secrets and mastering the secrets of universal medicine, and possessing the ability to melt and reshape diamonds, apparently he also knew all the secrets of alchemy, Casanova found him somewhat credible, although I don't think he believed everything that the Count told him. The relationship is characterized by Casanova's admiration mixed with skepticism towards Saint Germain's esoteric claims and flamboyant personality. This meeting stands out as a notable encounter between two legendary figures known for their mystique and charisma in 18th century European society. Now, the Count of Saint Germain allegedly had recorded interactions with Benjamin Franklin during Franklin's time in Paris in the late 18th century. They are said to have engaged in discussions on a variety of subjects, including politics, science, and philosophy. Franklin, known for his curiosity and broad intellectual interests, reportedly found the Count of Saint Germain to be fascinating when it came to conversation, just like everybody else. While the specifics of their relationship are somewhat speculative and not extensively documented, their shared intellectual pursuits likely facilitated mutual respect. Saint Germain's expertise in subjects like alchemy and diplomacy complemented Franklin's interests overall. Additionally, the Count of Saint Germain was involved behind the scenes with figures like Franklin and George Washington in efforts related to the establishment of the United States of America. This connection suggests some level of collaboration or alignment with key Enlightenment and revolutionary thinkers of that time. Now, there's a bit more regarding the Count of Saint Germain, George Washington, and the founding of the United States. The Count of Saint Germain is traditionally associated with George Washington through various esoteric and mythical accounts. According to these narratives, Saint Germain was a spiritual guide and protector during the American Revolutionary War, standing by Washington throughout the struggles for independence, including the harsh winter at Valley Forge. He is credited with inspiring events such as the writing of the U.S. Constitution and anointing George Washington as the first president of the United States. Saint Germain is said to have revealed the design of the American flag to a committee including Franklin and Washington, and gave pivotal inspiration at the signing of the Declaration of Independence in the year 1776. Many spiritual and New Age sources regard him as an ascended master who oversaw the spiritual foundation of America, guiding Washington and other founding fathers to the realization of what the United States was going to be one day. Now, the Count of Saint Germain is famously associated with alchemy, and this knowledge of alchemy is what many believe gave him the ability to live for centuries or even longer than that, and he was an adept practitioner of alchemical arts during the 18th century, and he was credited with remarkable feats such as the crystallization of carbon and the potential improving of flawed diamonds. In fact, there was one story that goes back to the time of Louis XV where Louis XV handed the Count of Saint Germain a diamond that was flawed. It had a scratch on it, and the Count told the king, I'll be back in 10 days or 15 days, or I think it was a month. It was a certain period of time that he was going to be gone to try to fix this diamond or to try to remove the scratch. And so after that time he came back. It was probably about a month, maybe less than a month, and he showed the king the diamond that he was given, and it was a perfect diamond. It no longer had a flaw on it at all or in it. And so the king was so impressed by this that he actually gave the Count of Saint Germain, according to the story, a room in his castle or in his palace, which was the Royal Chateau de Chambord, and he gave him a room there so he could just do alchemy and alchemical stuff, I guess, doing this all day, because the King of France, Louis XV, at that time was so impressed by this. Now, despite some modern skepticism about whether or not he was truly an alchemicalist in the traditional sense of turning base metals into gold, Saint Germain undoubtedly, if he was a real person, was involved in alchemical practices. Saint Germain was reportedly a high-ranking member, supposedly, of several Masonic lodges across Europe, and he is said to have had connections with multiple secret societies, including the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, and the Brotherhood of the Rose and the Cross. Now, some sources suggest that he acted as an underlying figure in Rosicrucian circles during the 18th century, and he may have had a significant influence behind Masonic and esoteric movements of that time. The Asiatic Brethren and the Knights of Light across Austria, Hungary, and France. I guess all of these associations with secret societies would be believed if you believe that, or if you think that the Count of Saint Germain is some kind of a time traveler, or as many people have claimed that he had the ability to live forever. Now, when it comes to all these fantastic claims about the Count of Saint Germain being here and being there and having this association with this person and being involved with something else, there's obviously people who don't believe this, and there's a lot of skeptics to go around to question all of this, which is totally fair. Now, when it comes to his association with secret societies, it's hard to track down anything, but some people have pointed out that, especially when it comes to Freemasonry, back when he was alive, even around the 18th century, there were stories coming out about him. Back then, especially if you were nobility, especially if you were an aristocrat, the Masons kept really meticulous records of everybody who joined their organization, and it would be pretty easy to find somebody with that name, with his background, joining a group like the Masons or a related Masonic group. But it looks like there haven't been any records that have come out to show that he was a part of any secret society, especially the Freemasons. Now, outside of the Masons, like I said, it's hard to track that down, but at least when it comes to the Freemasons, there's just no historical evidence whatsoever that he ever joined any Masonic lodge. And this is what you find over and over again with anything associated with the Count of Saint Germain. If you look at his association with Louis XV, a lot of it cannot be substantiated. It does seem that with Louis XV, though, there could have been somebody by his name, by the Count of Saint Germain, that was involved with King Louis XV. Because I know the foreign minister was documented as not trusting him, and somebody by that name may have gone and done diplomatic missions. But if you look at Louis XV, Catherine the Great, Marie Antoinette, a lot of the associations that those historical figures have with the Count of Saint Germain, they seem to be either embellished or just completely made up. There's just no concrete historical evidence to really put him anywhere that can be traced down by any historians. Now, despite all of these bizarre stories, there are even more sightings and more stories regarding the Count of Saint Germain that go back as far as the time of Christ, like I mentioned earlier in the video, and even some that place him in the 20th century. it's really bizarre how this guy just shows up pretty much everywhere. And it's not just anybody who makes a claim about seeing him. Very prominent historical figures make the claim that they've seen or dealt with the Count of Saint Germain in some way. The idea that Saint Germain could be a time traveler is a modern speculative twist on this existing myth surrounding him, and there are several reasons why people believe this, even though there's no concrete evidence to support anything like that. It's a great story, but I don't think there's any evidence at all to really support this idea. But the first being longevity and agelessness. Now, the most obvious basis for the time traveler theory is his alleged immortality. Various accounts from people who knew him when he was alive at various times claim that he didn't appear to be, any more than 35 to 40 years old, or maybe a little bit older than that, but that's basically it. He was said to have been seen at multiple royal courts in different European countries, often years or even decades apart. But he maintained the same appearance at the time, every single time, when he showed himself to anybody, and this included very high-ranking military officials, royalty, and aristocrats all over the continent of Europe. Now, despite all of the sightings that took place during the 17th century, there were sightings before and many after the 17th century that a lot of people may not be aware of. And there was many people who came forward saying that they had seen him alive and well. So there's this concept that comes from a lot of people from these theosophical societies and other esoteric groups that postulate that Saint Germain was more than just a regular man, that he was a man that understood time, and in these circles he's often referred to as a master of wisdom, or some kind of an ascended master or spiritual being that could transcend time and space, and that these concepts suggest that Saint Germain, through alchemy and other mystical practices, could manipulate time and thus was capable of living through different historical periods. So was he an immortal? Was he somebody who understood how to jump to other timelines using alchemy? I mean, very, very far-fetched claims, I know, but that's what makes this story so intriguing. Now, many theosophists such as Madame Blavatsky, Annie Besant, C.W. Leadbeater, and Guy Ballard all claim that the Count of Saint Germain is some kind of an ascended master who's given wisdom to them in some way. Now, believe it or not, there are actually claims that the Count of Saint Germain appeared at the crucifixion or was alive during that time, possibly as somebody known as the Wandering Jew. Now, this exists mainly in the realm of legend and esoteric lore. Some stories and theories suggest that the Count of Saint Germain either was or was closely related to the figure of the Wandering Jew, a mythical immortal man said to be cursed to wander the earth until the second coming of Jesus Christ because, according to the story, he taunted Jesus on his way to the crucifixion. But if there's anything to this story, Cartaphilus, according to some accounts, was said to have traveled west. Now, I don't know if that came later or if that came out of the Bible, that Cartaphilus went west, but this came from somewhere, and according to some narratives, Cartaphilus later traveled west and became the enigmatic Count of Saint Germain, a figure who appeared mysteriously in Europe centuries later, known for his alleged immortality, wisdom, and knowledge on everything apparently. Now, the Count of Saint Germain also has another alleged sighting that took place in World War I, and it happened when two Bavarian soldiers captured this person who they thought was a bit off and was very weird and acting really strange. Now, according to the account, he spoke many languages. He looked to be about 35 to 45 years old, so he was a bit older than the soldiers who captured him. Usually soldiers are a lot younger than 35 or 45. That's not usually like fighting age or age that somebody would enlist in the military at any point in history. So he was a bit older, and he knew many languages, and he also refused to disclose where he was from, and I think that's what kind of got him in trouble, and why they wanted to take him into custody was because they couldn't identify him from being in that area. So what this individual tells these soldiers next, at first they don't take it serious, but then later on, years later, after this story is over with, one of these soldiers who captured this guy remembers what he was told, and that's what makes everything that he was told so frightening. So he ends up telling these soldiers that the war that they're currently in is going to end in a few years, in the year 1918. But he said there's going to be another fiery leader that would come from Germany and would set that country on fire, and he would also set on fire the rest of the world and commit unspeakable acts of horror. Now, I guess this guy just kept rambling on, or he was telling the story to these two Bavarian soldiers, and they thought better of trying to deal with him, not because they were so terrified at that time of what he was saying, but maybe they just thought it was a waste of time to deal with him. He wasn't really worth dealing with because this is a wartime situation, and maybe they just thought, well, we have better things to do than to mess with some crazy person, so they let him go on his way. And sure enough, one of the soldiers who was there lived long enough to see all of this come to pass. So the war ended in 1918, and also there was another fiery leader that came from Germany. I wasn't able to find any kind of description of what these two Bavarian soldiers gave, so I can't find a description of what this guy looked like that they talked to and that they wanted to take into custody. I don't know if he looked anything like these portraits that have come out of Saint Germain, but there's another story there. Now, there was also a sighting of the Count as late as the 1930s in California with a movement known as I Am. Now, the I Am activity was founded by a guy named Guy Ballard, and I did mention him earlier in the video. In the early 1930s, Guy Ballard claimed to have met and been instructed by an ascended master named Saint Germain while hiking on Mount Shasta. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the movement. In this movement, Saint Germain was placed front and center and was claimed to be a Kohan or Chohan, I probably did not pronounce that correctly, or a lord of the seventh ray, as well as the spiritual sponsor and or protector of the United States. Now, the movement involved invoking and decreeing spiritual power, which followers believe helped protect major U.S. cities and remove negative spiritual energy during the 1930s. By 1938, the movement had about 1 million followers, and Ballard continued to talk about all these things, even up until his death in 1939. Now, truth be told, guys, other than a so-called meeting between Guy Ballard and the Count of Saint Germain, the Ascended Master, I really couldn't find a whole lot of details on what happened other than this alleged meeting taking place. I'm not sure if Guy Ballard was with a group of followers, if he was on some kind of a retreat, but I did find a reference to this in several articles when I looked up information for the story dealing with the Count of Saint Germain, that this allegedly had happened. I say allegedly a lot because a lot of this stuff you can't prove. And what a lot of critics like to point out about this so-called sighting is that the Count of Saint Germain already played a very pivotal role, a very central role in this organization, and how they saw Saint Germain as being this light worker or this ascended master. And so it's almost like Guy Ballard was already looking to have some kind of a spiritual experience, and so he just happened to see the guy that he worships, or I don't know if that's even the right word, but he sees the guy that he has taken so much inspiration from on a mountain in California. Now, the only thing that I can say to that, to provide a counter argument for this video, is that there is a lot of paranormal activity that happens out on Mount Shasta. Mount Shasta is like a really unique place, I think, if you're into the paranormal. It's one of these places like Sedona, Arizona. There are places like this all over the United States, all over the world, that have lots of UFO activity, lots of ghost activity, I think there's a lot of Bigfoot sightings around Mount Shasta as well. There's a lot of paranormal stuff, period, that happens in that area. And so of all the places that he has his sighting, it's probably like one of the more active paranormal hotspots that the United States has. And what's interesting too is I don't know how much that was known back when he was alive, if Mount Shasta was considered a paranormal hotspot. It could have been. I do know that back then they didn't have the internet, obviously. They used snail mail, and legacy media was really just getting started in terms of radio stations, and newspapers were around back then. But I don't know how much of this alternative information was around about Mount Shasta having so many stories dealing with the paranormal. I've even heard rumors that Mount Shasta has an extraterrestrial civilization in the mountain. So I've heard this. I can't tell you off the top of my head where I heard this, but I have heard these stories. There's a lot of bizarre stuff that happens there, and to me, if something did happen, it doesn't surprise me that it happened there, of all places.